The pen didn't tremble. That was the thing that would haunt everyone who witnessed it later. The absolute, clinical steadiness of Dr. Bruce Scott's hand as he pressed the ballpoint to paper and signed his name across the bottom of the medical consent form. Room 4, North, Neuro ICU, New York Presbyterian Hospital. Floor, so quiet, you could hear the ventilators breathe for the people who couldn't breathe for themselves. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Linda Scott, wife of 14 years, daughter of one of Manhattan's most respected federal judges, a woman who had put her own architectural career on hold to support her husband through his residency, his fellowships, his ascent to chief of cardiothoracic surgery at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, lay still in the bed behind him, eyes closed, tubes threading in and out of her body like vines. The machines around her humming with the soft, indifferent language of sustained life. She had been in this room for 19 days. Bruce signed the form without looking at her. He handed it back to Dr. Raymond Holt, the transplant coordinator, who glanced at it once, then looked up at Bruce with an expression that was careful and neutral, the way hospital staff learn to be when they have seen enough of human nature to stop being surprised by it. "You understand what you're authorizing, Dr. Scott," Holt said. It wasn't quite a question. "I do," Bruce said. Linda carried a donor card. She believed in this. "I'm honoring that." Holt nodded slowly. "The recipient has been notified. Surgery will be scheduled pending her continued non-recovery." Bruce finished for him. Smooth, practiced. The voice he used in boardrooms and operating theaters. "Yes, I understand the protocol." He buttoned his jacket. He checked his phone. He walked out of the room without saying goodbye to the woman in the bed. What Bruce Scott did not know, what he could not have known, because he had spent 14 years underestimating the woman he married, was that the file in the hospital system contained more than Linda's medical history. Linda had been a very thorough woman. She had always been a very thorough woman. If you're already feeling the weight of what's coming, you need to drop a comment right now and tell us, did Bruce just make the biggest mistake of his life? To the outside world, Bruce and Linda Scott were the perfect New York story. He was the surgeon, the one whose name appeared in New York Magazine's Doctors of the Year 3 times. The one whose colleagues called him Golden Hands, not entirely as a compliment, because men like Bruce had a way of making even admiration feel slightly threatening. He moved through the hospital corridors with the particular arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered, not by medical school, not by the hospital board, not by the body under his scalpel. She was the wife. But that description, like most descriptions of Linda Von Scott, was catastrophically incomplete. Linda had graduated top of her class from Columbia School of Architecture. She had shelved a career that her professors had called generational talent, when Bruce's schedule made 2 careers in one household feel impossible, and he had let her shelve it, because that is what men who believe their work is more important do. She had channeled that precise, architectural mind into everything else: the management of their Upper West Side townhouse, their finances, their social calendar, their charitable foundations. She ran it all with the quiet, load-bearing strength of a column that holds up the entire structure while no one looks at it. What Bruce had not understood, what he had chosen not to understand, was that a woman with that kind of mind does not simply manage a household. She designs it. She architects it. She builds redundancies into the system. She plans for structural failure. Linda had started planning for structural failure approximately 2 years ago. 2 years ago, to be precise, was when she first noticed the small changes. The extra hour before Bruce came home from the hospital, the locked second phone, the name Mary appearing once in a text she was not meant to see. She had not confronted him. She had not cried. She had not done any of the things that a woman in a film would do in that moment. She had called her lawyer. His name was Elliot Marsh, senior partner at Marsh & Duval. He had been Linda's father's attorney before he was hers, and he was the kind of lawyer that the very powerful hire specifically because he made other lawyers nervous. Elliot was 71 years old, had seen 4 decades of New York money move and hide and run and get caught, and he had the eyes of a man who had never once confused sentiment with strategy. "What do you want to do, Linda?" he had asked her when she laid out what she knew. "I want to be ready," she had said. For whatever he decides to do, she was very ready. The accident happened on a Friday evening in October. Linda had found out that same afternoon through a private investigator she had retained 8 months earlier that Bruce and Mary Peterson were spending that weekend at a hotel in Midtown. The same hotel where Bruce had told Linda he would be attending a cardiology conference. She had the receipts. She had the photographs. She had everything Elliot Marsh had told her she would need. She had called Bruce, not to confront him, simply to tell him she knew, to give him the chance to come home and have an honest conversation before the lawyers made it something else entirely. He hadn't answered. She had left a voicemail. The voicemail distracted him. He would later tell himself it was the voicemail, but the truth was more complicated and less forgivable than that. He had been driving recklessly, by any legal standard, while listening to it on speaker, his mind somewhere else entirely, his eyes off the road for 3, perhaps 4 seconds, at an intersection where the light had just changed. He didn't hit another car. He didn't hurt anyone else. What happened was this: the sharp sound of a horn, Bruce's reflexive swerve, and Linda, who was not with him, who was across town in their townhouse, who had already sent the voicemail and gone to make herself a cup of tea and was now completely unaware of any of this, received a phone call 90 minutes later from a number she didn't recognize. It was the hospital. Not about Bruce, about her mother, who had suffered a massive stroke and been brought in by ambulance. Linda had grabbed her coat, run for the door, taken the stairs too fast in her haste, and fallen. The fall was severe, traumatic brain injury. She was unconscious before the ambulance arrived. The cruelest part of the story, the part that would later make grown men and women in courtrooms press their lips together to keep from reacting, was this: Bruce had been driving recklessly because he was listening to Linda's voicemail, telling him she knew about the affair, and the accident that sent Linda to the hospital was not the one Bruce caused. It was the chain reaction of panic and distraction that radiated out from his lie, reaching her through a phone call, translating into hurry, translating into a flight of stairs she ran down too fast. He had not pushed her, but the physics of what he had done had found her anyway. Linda's mother survived the stroke. Linda did not wake up. Mary Peterson was 34 years old and understood exactly what she was. She was not naive about it. She was not a villain in the way that cartoons draw villains, with a cold heart and no conscience. She was something more ordinary and therefore more dangerous. A woman who had decided that what she wanted was more important than what she owed to someone she had never met. She had rationalized it in the way people rationalize when the alternative is giving something up. Linda was cold. Linda was distant. Bruce was lonely. These were the stories Mary had constructed, and she had lived inside them long enough that she had almost stopped knowing they were constructed. She had been Bruce's surgical resident when it started. The power dynamic was not something she had examined too closely. She was sharp, ambitious, and had understood quickly that Bruce Scott was a man who collected beautiful, capable women the way some men collect art for the pleasure of ownership and the signal it sent about his own taste. She had also understood, 3 months into the affair, that Bruce was not going to leave Linda, not easily, not willingly. But then Linda had her accident, and Mary had watched the doors of possibilities swing open with a feeling she was not proud of, and had walked through them anyway. Mary's kidneys were failing, both of them. She had been on dialysis, for 14 months, on the transplant waiting list for nearly as long, and her condition was deteriorating in ways the doctors described with careful, practiced optimism that Mary saw right through. She needed a kidney. She needed it soon. It was Mary who had first looked at the transplant compatibility charts. It was Mary who had noted with the careful clinical eye of someone who was also a physician that Linda Scott's blood type, physical profile, and preliminary organ health made her a statistical match. It was Mary who had mentioned this to Bruce one night in their hotel room with the deliberateness of someone who had been building toward saying it for weeks. "She carries a donor card," Mary had said. I checked. Bruce had been very quiet for a very long time. "She's not brain dead," he had said finally. "No," Mary agreed. "Not yet." The word "yet" sat in the room between them like a verdict. Bruce had not said yes that night. He had not said anything. But he had not left the room. He had not picked up his phone and called the hospital ethics board. He had not done any of the things that a man with a functioning moral center would have done in that moment. He had simply waited, and the machines in Linda's room had hummed their indifferent hum. And the 19 days had passed. And on the 20th day, Bruce Scott had taken the elevator to the 4th floor, walked into room 4 North, picked up the pen, and signed his name. The hospital's patient records management system flagged the consent form at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after it was submitted. This was not unusual. Medical consent for organ donation from a non-brain-dead patient existing in a prolonged coma state required additional review steps. There were legal protections built into the process, firewalls designed to prevent exactly the kind of thing that it would later become clear Bruce Scott had been intending. What was unusual was what the record system found when it cross-referenced Linda Scott's file against its external legal documentation database. 3 months before her accident, 3 months before, while she was still walking and talking and meeting with her architect friends for lunch and smiling for photographs at charity galas standing next to a husband she already knew was betraying her, Linda Scott had visited the offices of Marsh and Duval and signed a document. It was a medical directive addendum, drafted by Elliot Marsh, reviewed by 2 independent attorneys, notarized, filed with the hospital's legal department, filed also with the county clerk's office, filed also, separately, with the offices of 3 different law firms who had been instructed to act as custodians of the document. Linda had been very thorough. The document stated, in language that Elliot Marsh had spent considerable care making airtight, the following: that any medical decision involving the removal, donation, or transfer of Linda Scott's organs or tissue in any state of incapacity required the signed approval of her designated medical authority proxy. That proxy was not Bruce Scott. It was her father, the Honorable Gerald Vaughn, senior federal judge for the Southern District of New York, retired. And attached to that directive, this was the part that the record system flagged in red, the part that immediately triggered a call to the hospital's chief counsel. The part that would keep 3 attorneys awake for the rest of that night was a secondary clause. The clause stated that in the event any party attempted to execute a medical decision on Linda Scott's behalf without going through the designated proxy, that attempt would constitute a triggering event. And the triggering event would activate a forensic financial audit already prepared, already filed, already handed to the relevant authorities of all joint and individual financial accounts, assets, trusts, and transactions associated with one doctor, Bruce Alexander Scott, going back 7 years. Elliot Marsh had spent those 7 months doing his homework. The audit package contained documentation of $2.3 million moved through accounts Bruce maintained without Linda's knowledge. It contained evidence of tax fraud. It contained records of an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that had been funded, in part, using income from a private surgical practice. Bruce operated under a shell corporation, income that should have been disclosed under their prenuptial financial transparency agreement, and wasn't. It contained records that connected Bruce Scott, financially and otherwise, to Mary Peterson in ways that went beyond a personal relationship. It contained everything. Linda had spent 2 years building a case. She had not built it for revenge. She had built it because she was an architect, and architects design structures that hold up even when no one is there to hold them up. She had built it to survive without her. Elliot Marsh's phone rang at 12:04 a.m. He was not asleep. He had not been sleeping well for weeks because he had known this call was coming, in one form or another, and he had been waiting for it, the way you wait for a storm you have watched building on the horizon for a very long time. He listened to the hospital's chief counsel explain what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was a skill that had taken him 40 years to perfect. Then he said, calmly, "I'll be there in 45 minutes. Do not process the consent. Do not contact Dr. Scott. Contact Judge Vaughn. You have his number in the file." He put the phone down. He got dressed. He called his driver. Gerald Vaughn answered on the first ring. He was 81 years old, and he had been a federal judge for 32 of those years. And when Elliot Marsh told him what Bruce Scott had done, the silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Get to the hospital," the judge said. "I'll make the other calls." The other calls, it would later emerge, went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, to the New York State Health Department's Office of Professional Medical Conduct, and to a journalist at the New York Times who had been Judge Vaughn's former law clerk and who owed him a professional debt she had always said she would repay when the moment was right. The moment was right. Bruce Scott arrived at the hospital at 7:15 the following morning, with the practiced calm of a man who believed he had done something irreversible and gotten away with it. He was wearing his white coat, his ID badge, his name embossed on his office door at the end of the cardiothoracic surgery corridor, a door he would walk through for the last time that morning without knowing it was the last time. His chief of staff met him in the corridor outside his office. Her name was Dr. Pamela Rhodes, and she was a woman who had worked alongside Bruce Scott for 11 years, which was long enough to have developed opinions about him that she had kept carefully to herself. She had 2 men with her. They wore suits, not scrubs. "Bruce," she said. Her voice was completely level. "These men are from the Office of Professional Medical Conduct. They need to speak with you." Bruce looked at the men. He looked at Pamela. His face did something complicated, that it rarely did something uncertain, something that in a lesser man might have been the beginning of panic, but that in Bruce Scott manifested as a very controlled stillness that the men in suits would later describe in their report as a subject demonstrating awareness of the situation. "About what?" he said. One of the men held up an official document. "Dr. Scott, we're here regarding the consent form you executed last night for the proposed organ donation of Linda Scott. We have questions about the authorization process and the circumstances surrounding the form. We'd also like to discuss some financial irregularities that have come to our attention." "Financial irregularities," Bruce repeated. His voice was still controlled, but something behind his eyes was moving very fast. "Among other things, yes. The forensic audit had been delivered to the relevant federal offices at 6 a.m., 7 years of transactions. $2.3 million in undisclosed income. Tax fraud, totaling an amount that, when his accountants later calculated it fully, would represent criminal liability at the federal level. The shell corporation, through which Bruce had been funneling private surgical income, bore Mary Peterson's home address as its registered office, a fact she had agreed to without. She would later desperately claim, understanding the full implications. The hospital board met in emergency session at 9 a.m. Bruce's surgical privileges were suspended pending the investigation. His access card stopped working at the elevators at 9:47 a.m. By noon, his name had been removed from the door. The New York Times piece ran online at 2 p.m. It was careful and precise and devastating in the specific way that good journalism is devastating. It did not editorialize. It simply laid out facts in sequence, and the sequence was enough. The headline read, "Prominent NYC surgeon investigated after signing donation consent for Comatose wife in alleged unauthorized medical decision." It was trending within the hour. Mary Peterson had been in the surgical prep area on another floor when her pager went off with a message from the transplant coordinator. The surgery was canceled, authorization had been revoked, and she was being asked to report to the chief of medicine's office immediately regarding her role in the matter. She sat down in a hallway chair and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and stared at a point on the floor in front of her for a very long time. She had pushed him to sign. She had told herself it was the only way. She had looked at those compatibility charts and at her own deteriorating lab results, and she had made a calculation that had felt, in the private arithmetic of desperation, like the only calculation available to her. She had not thought about what Linda had built while she wasn't looking. No one had. That was the thing about Linda Scott. She was the kind of woman people didn't think about when she wasn't in the room. Quiet, steady, architectural. The load-bearing column that everyone takes for granted until the building starts to fall. Gerald Vaughn was sitting in the chair beside his daughter's bed when it happened. He had not left the hospital since Elliot Marsh called him at midnight. He was 81 years old, and he had the presence of a man who had spent 3 decades in courtrooms, which meant he had learned how to sit in a room and be patient in a way that ordinary people never quite manage. He was holding Linda's hand. He was not speaking. He was simply present in the way that people are present when they know presence is the only thing they have to offer. The machines hummed. And then at 3:17 inches the afternoon, while the floors below them were still processing the earthquake that had begun at midnight, Linda Scott's eyelids moved. It was not dramatic. That was the thing. There was no sudden sitting up, no gasp, no cinematic moment of resurrection. There was simply a flicker, a tremor across closed eyes. A hand that had been lying still now exerting the faintest possible pressure against the old man's palm. Gerald Vaughn pressed the call button without taking his eyes off his daughter's face. The neurologist was there in 4 minutes, then 2 nurses, then another doctor. The room filled with the controlled urgency that medical professionals carry like a second skin, focused, competent, not quite excitement, but something adjacent to it. Linda's eyes opened at 3:31 p.m. They were confused at first. The light was wrong. The ceiling was wrong. Everything was white and bright, and her father was there, which was right. That was right. Her father's face was familiar and solid, and she held on to it while her brain slowly began to reassemble the world. "Linda," Gerald Vaughn said, very quietly, "I'm here. You're safe." She tried to speak. Couldn't. The tube prevented it. She managed, with enormous effort, to form a question with her eyes. He understood the question. He had been a judge. He had spent decades reading the faces of people trying to communicate truth under pressure. "Everything is being taken care of," he said. "Everything." He did not tell her about Bruce. Not yet. He did not tell her about the form, the clause, the audit, the collapse happening 3 floors below and across the city in simultaneous waves. He did not tell her that the system she had built, the architecture of her own survival, had triggered exactly as she had designed it to trigger, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the force she had calculated it would carry. He simply held her hand, and she was alive, and downstairs, the walls were coming down. Bruce Scott was placed under formal federal investigation at 4:30 p.m. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been thorough and fast. They had the audit package, they had the Shell Corporation records, they had the tax filings. They had 7 years of transactions that told a story so clear it required almost no interpretation. The medical ethics investigation ran parallel, separate but equally consequential. His surgical license was suspended that evening. His lawyer, the one he called Scrambling, from the hospital parking garage, told him within 20 minutes of reviewing the preliminary information that he was looking at federal tax fraud charges, potential criminal liability for the unauthorized medical consent, and, depending on what the investigation turned up, about the circumstances of his distracted driving the night of Linda's accident, possibly more. "How much of this did you know was coming?" his lawyer asked him. Bruce was quiet for a very long time. "None of it," he finally said. His lawyer believed him, which was the most damning part. This was not a man who had been outmaneuvered because he played a dangerous game and lost. This was a man who had been outmaneuvered because he had fundamentally misunderstood what kind of person his wife was, and what she was capable of, and what she had been doing for 2 years while he sat across the dinner table from her and assumed she knew nothing and had built nothing and would never be able to touch him. He had underestimated her so completely that he had not even known a game was being played. That was not bad luck. That was the most devastating kind of defeat, the kind that comes from contempt. Mary Peterson resigned from the hospital that evening, before she could be asked to resign. She issued a statement through an attorney that said, among other things, that she had not been fully aware of the legal and ethical dimensions of her conversations with Dr. Scott. Legal analysts on 3 different news programs discussed at length how credible that statement was. The consensus was not kind. Within 48 hours, Bruce Scott's assets were frozen, pending the federal investigation. The townhouse on the Upper West Side, which was held in both their names, which meant that Linda's interests were protected while Bruce's were exposed, was not accessible to him. His accounts at 3 different private banks were flagged. His memberships at the 2 clubs where he conducted much of his informal professional networking were quietly suspended. The name Dr. Bruce Scott moved through the elite medical and financial networks of New York City the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, total, leaving nothing behind. His colleagues stopped returning his calls. His residents, who had admired him and feared him in equal measure, gave statements to investigators that were careful and factual and devastating. The hospital board issued a public statement expressing their commitment to patient safety and ethical medical practice that mentioned his name exactly once and would not mention it again. He had been, for 20 years, one of the most powerful surgeons in one of the most powerful cities in the world. He had moved through rooms as if he owned them. He had spoken with the authority of a man who had never been seriously challenged. He had made decisions about patients, about his hospital, about the women in his life, with the casual confidence of someone who had simply never had to reckon with consequences. The reckoning, when it arrived all at once. It did not announce itself. It did not give him time to prepare. It simply materialized, fully formed, assembled over 2 years by a woman in a white townhouse who had done her homework and filed her paperwork and trusted that the structure she had built would hold. It held. 3 weeks after she woke up, Linda Scott gave her first interview from her hospital room. She had requested no cameras. One journalist, her father's former clerk from the Times, the one who had broken the story, a woman Linda had met exactly twice and trusted completely for reasons that had nothing to do with the story and everything to do with the kind of judgment Linda had always exercised about people. She spoke for 40 minutes. Her voice was still slightly uneven from the weeks on the ventilator, but her words were precise and calm and entirely without self-pity. "People keep asking me if I'm angry," Linda said. "I think they want me to be. It makes a better story." The journalist waited. "I'm not angry," Linda said. "I was angry 2 years ago, when I first understood what was happening. I cried. I grieved. I went through all of it, privately, and then I decided that grief wasn't going to be the thing I built my future on, so I built something else. Were you afraid? The journalist asked. Of what might happen to you, medically? Linda looked at her for a moment. I had a plan, she said simply. I always had a plan. The divorce proceedings were already underway. Linda's legal team, Elliot Marsh at the helm, 3 additional attorneys supporting him, all of them moving with the calm efficiency of people executing a strategy that had been prepared long in advance, had filed within days of her waking up. The asset division, given the forensic audit revelations, was unlikely to be complicated in Bruce's favor. The federal tax fraud charges carried a potential sentence of up to 7 years per count. There were 4 counts. The Medical Ethics Board investigation was ongoing. The outcome, most observers agreed, would end Bruce Scott's surgical career permanently. Linda did not comment on the criminal proceedings. When the journalist asked about them, she smiled very slightly and said, "That's in the hands of people who are much better at that kind of thing than I am." But there was something else. Something the journalist noted in her published account of the interview that she could not quite explain, except as a feeling, the particular atmosphere of a room where someone knows something they are not yet ready to say. Near the end of the conversation, Linda had looked out the window for a long moment, at the gray November sky above the city, at the skyline she had grown up in and studied in and built her life in. "I want to ask you something personal," the journalist had said, "and you don't have to answer. Go ahead. Did you know, when you were building all of this, the directive, the clause, the audit package, did you know he would actually try it?" Linda was quiet for a very long time. Then, "I knew who he was. That was enough." She turned back from the window. "He wasn't the only one I was watching," she said. And then she looked at the journalist with an expression that was calm and precise and ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age, and she did not say another word on the subject. The journalist sat with that sentence for a long time after the interview ended. She sat with it on the elevator down, and in the lobby, and in the cab back to the Times building. She turned it over and examined it from different angles. He wasn't the only one I was watching. It was not until she was sitting at her desk, opening her notes, preparing to write, that she understood what it meant. And when she understood, she picked up her phone and called her editor. "We need to talk," she said. "There's more to this story." There was always more to this story. Linda Scott had always been a very thorough woman. Comment right now. Who do you think Linda was also watching? What is she hiding? Do you think Bruce deserves everything that's coming? And if you want part 2, where Linda walks out of that hospital and into a story that will shake everyone left standing, follow this channel right now and share this video. The next chapter is going to be the most explosive one yet.